Welcome everyone to the Prodigy EMS Book Club. We are so excited to have you on this webinar today. And I want to give a special thanks and a big welcome to our special guests, Kevin Hazzard and John Moon. Kevin, of course, is the author of American Sirens, the incredible story of the Black men who became America's first paramedics. And that is the book we get to talk about today in our book club. And Kevin is a journalist, a TV writer, and a former paramedic. He wrote another book that I'm sure most of you have read called 1,000 Naked Strangers, which was published back in 2016. And he now writes for film and TV and has work produced by Hulu, CBS, ABC, and Universal. He has done quite a bit of journalism around places like the Atavist, Men's Journal, Washington Post, and Atlanta Magazine. And he is a sought-after voice on emergency medicine, and we are so excited to have him here today. Thank you, Kevin, for being here.
No, thanks. It's an honor.
Great. And John Moon, of course, appears as the principal character in this extraordinary story that Kevin tells. He retired as assistant chief of Pittsburgh EMS, and John has been singing the praises of Freedom House and making this his life's work, as he told me, to make sure everyone knows about it. John, thank you so much for.
Great. I really appreciate it.
Terrific. We also have today Maya Dorset, Prodigy's medical director, who will be acting with me as moderator. So let's get started, everyone. I want to dig into kind of this definitive accounting of the first paramedics in the country. It's a riveting story that details the struggles and hurdles that these Black paramedics overcame to be able to provide advanced level life support to patients in Pittsburgh. So Kevin, if you could give us a synopsis of the major players and events, kind of help us with what we need to focus on when we're thinking about the history of Freedom House Ambulance Service.
Yeah, so I think we all are familiar with 1965, the white paper. We get that, you know, there were hearses, there were police officers, and there were volunteer firefighters. And then in the early 1970s, the Department of Transportation got involved. The TV show Emergency came about, and the field as we know it today sort of just poofed into existence. And that's really where this story lives. So in terms of players, Peter Safar is, you know, I mean, it's very difficult to say enough about this guy. So he's this Austrian-born anesthesiologist who came to the US after the Second World War, and he, you know, had trained as a surgeon, but he realized that anesthesiology, this brand new field, was a place that he could really make his mark. And so he switches over. And when he comes to the US, one of the first things that he does, as I'm sure many of you know, he invents CPR. So he reads this study, and it says expired air contains enough oxygen to keep somebody alive. And he uses that piece of information, and he pairs it with what was then known as rescue breathing, which wasn't breathing at all. Of course, it was sort of more like positioning, you know, rolling people over, pushing on backs, moving of arms, hoping to inflate the lungs based on body movement. He was not a believer in this philosophy. So he sets up a series of tests in which, you know, he sedates and then paralyzes his volunteers. And then while these people are lying on the ground, he tries the method that they know does not work. He records that it does not work. He records that their oxygen levels are dipping to dangerously low levels. And then once they reach, you know, sort of critical mass, he brings in these untrained lay people, including Boy Scouts. He gives them this 15 to 30 second crash course on rescue breathing, and then they use that to keep people alive. He, you know, gathers all this data over the course of 40 tests. He, in the late 1950s, he flies to Los Angeles. He publishes his data, and instantly, you know, CPR is born. He pairs rescue breathing with chest compressions. He travels around the world. And so the way lives are saved is permanently changed globally by this single guy. So that is the sort of person that he is. He's very brilliant. He's absolutely fearless. He's dedicated, and he's clearly very persuasive, because if you imagine, if somebody came to you, if I came to you and said, hey, I'm going to sedate you and paralyze you and then keep you alive with an 11-year-old boy, you would say no. You would walk out of the room and that would be it. So I'm clearly not the salesman that Peter Safar was, but this is the sort of mind that he was. He moves to Pittsburgh in the early 1960s, and he takes all those characteristics that made him so successful in developing CPR and he trains them on pre-hospital medicine. He has seen what the city has to offer, which at that time was a police-borne ambulance service. They had little training, less equipment. There was a very high-profile death that took place in the city, a former governor, a former mayor, whose death is ultimately blamed on the lack of care that he got during transport. Safar himself was very close to, he had a very personal tragedy that was a result of poor pre-hospital care. So he knows all too well what is missing. And so he sets out to fix it. He redesigns the ambulance. He turns it from the hearse into what we have now, which of course, he installs the captain's chair. He, puts in wall-mounted suctioning. He figures out what sort of drugs and equipment this ambulance should carry. And then he designs a training course for the sort of person that will be driving this ambulance. And it's this 8-month course that covers the full spectrum of emergencies, everything from OB to respiratory to cardiac, trauma, seizures, everything that we do today on an ambulance. And he pairs that classroom work with time in the hospital, OR, ER, ICU, OB, the morgue. Again, these are things that didn't happen. There was not, medical directors were not a big part of EMS at that point. He brings them in. So he essentially is developing the field that we know today. And the linchpin to this whole thing, of course, is the paramedic, which does not exist. And that's what he's got to figure out, where to find these people. And where he finds them is in the Hill District. So if you imagine Watts or Harlem or the south side of Chicago, that is essentially Pittsburgh's Hill District. It's a neighborhood that, kind of had been sucker punched by fate. And by the mid 1960s, people living there were looking for an opportunity. And there's an organization called Freedom House, which was designed to provide job opportunities for people living in the Hill. Problem was, they had a lot of people who were looking for jobs, but didn't have any great jobs to provide them with. Well, across town, here's Peter Safar with this incredible job, this very inspiring career, but he doesn't have the people to fill it. So there's a man named Phil Hallen, who is, this kind of visionary nonprofit leader who brings the two together. So Phil Hallen brings Jim McCoy from Freedom House, and he brings Peter Safar from University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. He brings them together, and through that meeting is born the paramedic. And so it's a difficult recruiting process still, but what, you now have the people who will be entering the first paramedic training course. And of course, they are, 24 Black men from the Hill District. By design, they wanted this program to be of, for, and by the Hill. So those are, two very important aspects to the story. Another, of course, is another doctor named Nancy Caroline. Nancy Caroline was she was an incredibly intelligent woman, born in the Boston area. She's a young Jewish woman who graduated from high school 2 years early, goes to Radcliffe, which was Harvard's sister school before they began admitting women to Harvard. She then goes to medical school at Case Western University in Ohio. She does her residency in Cleveland, and she gets a fellowship working in the ICU for Peter Safar in 1974. And as soon as she arrives, Safar is looking for a way to bolster the Freedom House program. The President Gerald Ford had commissioned a group of physicians to go out under the auspices of the Department of Transportation and create the nation's first standardized training curriculum for paramedics. They're not sure who they're going to choose for this. Somebody is. And Peter Safar is looking at his organization, which has been, sort of under fire by the police, by the local government, by some residents within the city. And he sees this as an opportunity to cement Freedom House's legacy. And so he needs someone to come in and lead this group, revitalize the training, because it's been a few years since they started. Medicine's constantly training. So he wants to bring it up to the absolute top that it can be. And so he needs this dynamic physician who's going to jump in and do all this work and really be able to get things going. He has smart, he has dynamic, he just does not have anybody willing to take on this particular job. Doctors were not interested in any sort of medicine that happened outside of the field. They were not believers in it, nor were they particularly interested in Freedom House. And so in comes this young doctor who's very early 30s. She's just arrived for his fellowship. Again, this is the father of CPR, one of the guys who helped to invent the modern ICU. He is a larger than life figure. And so he turns to this brand new physician and he basically says to her, you're going to take this job. Nancy, being Nancy, says, no, I'm not. And she pushes back. And the two of them have this battle that goes back and forth for about a month, where she refuses to say yes. Finally, he meets her demands. She takes over the role and immediately regrets it. She doesn't know what a paramedic is. She doesn't know what an ambulance is. She doesn't know how to make any of this work. She doesn't know the guys, and she doesn't know how to behave around them. They look at her, they don't see how she could possibly understand them. So there's this bridge that they need to gap, or this divide that they need to bridge. And of course, the way they do that is through the work. Nancy buries herself in the ambulance light. She sleeps in the station. She runs calls. She's listening on calls. She's very difficult, very demanding, but also very passionate. Her passion for the work, her belief in what they're doing, helps them, helps create this sense of trust. The fact that she's there with them, she's not just off somewhere in a hospital sending down dictates. The fact that she is with them, working with them, a relationship is born. And through that relationship, Nancy herself is sort of rescued from a personal tragedy. Freedom House is elevated to the best care that they've ever delivered. And by the summer of 1975, they are named by President Gerald Ford's commission as the standard in EMS in America. And Nancy Caroline goes on to write the first standardized training curriculum, which of course is emergency care in the streets. That book, which many of us use for decades and decades and decades, is born from the work that was done in Freedom House. The final leg of this incredible story are the people that rode the ambulances themselves. As I said, these were, men from the Hill District, a place that much of America had written off. Certainly the city of Pittsburgh had written off. And as John will tell you, the world decided they didn't want them and that they weren't worth much. The mistake that they made was not telling these guys that was the case. And they were determined to show the world what they could do. And this strange job, this paramedic, which again, they'd never heard of, they'd never been on an ambulance, they didn't know anything about medicine. But somewhere in this job, they saw a way for the world to recognize them, a way for people to finally acknowledge what they were capable of, to have their voices heard. And so they took this job and they were an immediate success. They start in the spring of 1968, in the immediate aftermath of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Within 2 years, a test done or a study of emergency calls that were run by Freedom House, volunteer fire departments, and the police showed that while the police did the wrong thing 60% of the time with critical patients, and volunteer fire departments did the wrong thing 80% of the time with critical patients, Freedom House did the right thing 78% of the time. That model, the educational model, the equipping and staffing, is borrowed from other services around the country. People fly into Pittsburgh from all around to see what they're doing and to see how they may either take the entire program or bring it home, or take bits and pieces that work for them. Safar goes and helps create the National Registry in Columbus. The Freedom House paramedics travel as far as Mainz, Germany, to give demonstrations to an international group of physicians who watches them perform, listens to what they have to say, looks at their call sheets, and comes to the conclusion that a paramedic in the field in an emergency call is as good as a similarly equipped physician would be in that moment. And, that is, obviously a huge declaration in the early 1970s when this thing is still in its seminal phases, but it is the product of the work and the dedication that the people at Freedom House did. So that is, a story of, that is an encapsulation of various players, the stakes, and what was happening at the time in the late 60s, early 70s.
Well done, Kevin. That was Cliff's notes, or Kevin's notes, for those of you who haven't read it yet. What an incredible story. Thank you for that. That's super helpful. And John, did you really do all that stuff? Wow. That's impressive. I'd love to hear sort of how yours and Kevin's relationship started. You know, you go off and become the assistant chief of EMS in Pittsburgh and then retire. But what happened when Kevin called you, and what were you thinking about in terms of, wow, here comes Freedom House again, or maybe for the first time? Tell us about that.
Well, it was quite unique. Kevin basically reached out to me on Facebook, I believe, and that was roughly about 4 years ago. It was in October, to be exact. I believe October 18th, the exact date. And he
Who's
was
historian now?
Yes. He was requiring about Freedom House, and at that particular time, I had kind of convinced myself after retiring from Pittsburgh EMS that I wanted to go on a mission to make sure that the history and the legacy of Freedom House would not be forgotten. So when Kevin reached out to me, I was more than anxious to get started with explaining to him some of the hurdles and barriers and distractions that we had to overcome at Freedom House. And as a result of that, we had obviously the book, but even though I'm kind of like the primary focus of a large part of the book, my primary goal is to make sure that the history of Freedom House and the other individuals that work there, all of that comes into fruition also. And I'm kind of on this mission now to make sure that no one ever forgets the groundbreaking inventions, the medications that we introduced outside of the hospital, the equipment that was introduced outside of the hospital, and the training itself will not be forgotten. So this is one of the greatest opportunities with this podcast to let individuals know that there was a history before EMS that exists today, and the foundation relies with Freedom House, which was a group of individuals that society as a whole had given up on. We were labeled as hardcore unemployables, the least likely to succeed, and society's throwaway. And as Kevin mentioned, society made a mistake. They didn't tell us that. So we went about doing things that are emulated today because we were just living in the moment, trying to provide a service to a community that had to solely rely on the police. And that was a great concern at that time.
So, John, I hope you can rest assured that everyone on this webinar and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands more EMS providers are with you on this mission to make sure that Freedom House is not forgotten and instead just told to everyone and included in curricula across the country. We'll definitely talk about that today because people have been asking. Kevin, what inspired you to write the book? Where did the idea come from? Give us that genesis, and then what was it like writing it? What was that time commitment? What were your research strategies? Would love to hear the background.
Yeah. So, as John said, quite down to the moment. I reached out to him shortly after having come across a story. After Naked Strangers came out, somebody who read it had reached out to me, said, "Hey, I read your book, but do you know how it began? And have you ever heard of Freedom House?" And I had not. And so I started researching, and I kept thinking I was going to stumble upon the definitive account of this thing. Because again, so many of us have, when you go through EMT school, when you go through paramedic school, you hear about, you read about Napoleon because he was the first one to do triage. And, you hear about the bits and pieces, you hear about the white paper. You are vaguely aware that before ambulances, it was hearses. But I was not familiar with this. And this seemed like, an interest, the genesis of this seemed to me to be very interesting. So I started researching, and, I found nothing substantial, nothing that told the entire story. So I just started looking around. Luckily, there was a very public battle that went on for years between Freedom House and the city of Pittsburgh. And the result of that is thousands, literally thousands of newspaper articles. So I was able to track the development of this thing from 1966, when a very famous man dies and everybody goes, wait a minute, this EMS service that we have is almost useless. Is there not a better way to do this? All the way through to the moment when the mayor shuts them down. And as I started going through this, one of the names that kept popping up was John Moon. And, John, I focused the story on him, from a Freedom House perspective, and because he was, his story it really touches on so many of the aspects, where he started to where he ended. In so many ways, it follows the arc of Freedom House. But his willingness to talk to me, his eagerness for the world to hear what had happened, it doesn't seem like it because he's a main character of a book, but he never, it was not his intention to have his name known or to have people talk about him. I had to, over the course of 4 years, I had to pull all these details out of him, and everyone involved was very similar. And all they really wanted was for the world to stop and to acknowledge what had happened during this time, and just to recognize their place in history. So to me, it was humbling. At times it felt overwhelming because there was this massive trove of information, this huge piece of history that should be told. And my fear was that I wasn't going to do it justice. And I felt that the people involved needed it. And so, it was an inspiring, humbling process. And I enjoyed the entire thing.
Great. We've got a pretty active chat going on here, and it looks like there is another member of Freedom House. I'd love to for Bill to come on and say hello. Bill, if you could unmute yourself, or make sure your audio and video is on, and just say hello and introduce yourself. That'd be amazing.
Greetings, everyone. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And honestly, hello to the many colleagues, well, not many, the number here from various other points of my career, Casey and Bill Mergendahl and David Page. Thank you for being the hero of keeping the flame alive and carrying the torch for a while there. There have been others. Obviously, I wasn't one of the first unemployable Black people, but I was probably one of the unemployable people looking for a job and a place to be. Let me just say this. Having lived it from 70 to 76, the book authentically transported me back there. Every page was reliving the experience. So I have the greatest admiration for Kevin as an author, so skilled. And the one comment I made at several points along here in the book, captured it too, is how did the people of the Hill District and these Freedom House employees, they weren't EMTs yet. We didn't even have EMTs till the EMS Act. But the EMTs and paramedics of Freedom House, who were Black and struck by this new guy coming in who was white, how did they treat me? What I conveyed was that I was always treated with the greatest respect by the people of Freedom House and the patients and the members of the community of that poor, economically, racially distressed ghetto that had been coming under such societal abuse. And my catch-all comment was, they soon realized they hired somebody who was only white on the outside. And I would still say that holds true to this day. And I owe my remainder of my career to Freedom House. So with all that, thank you. And anybody have any questions, I'd be happy to do them. But hello to everybody out there.
Wonderful. John or Kevin, if you wanted to say hi while Bill is here.
Hi, Bill. It's been a long time. I've heard so much about you, but it's great to see you.
John Moon, they all lie. Don't believe a word of it. I swear to it. I never did any of those things, even though you know firsthand. You know where the bones are buried, man. I mean, me
Yes,
and my
I do.
erratic driving. I'll never forget that job evaluation you did. But so proud of you, John. So proud of you and all you have done. Thank you. And again, Kevin, thank you for writing such an authentic read. Anybody who reads it will experience the reality as close as I can tell you.
Well, I appreciate that, Bill, very much. It means a lot. For anyone who is wondering about this this lightly pigmented man here in front of us, what happened was, if you haven't read the book, in the early 1970s, Freedom House was always under the gun, financially speaking. And in the early 1970s, Richard Nixon was sitting upon a nation that was in the midst of a very unpopular war and was fighting inflation. And he was looking for economic programs that would help. And so he married the two. He said, okay, I'm going to create a program in which returning veterans will get jobs. And the incentive will be any company that hires them is going to get this federal money that I'm going to set aside. Of course, because it's a federal government, it needs to be an equal opportunity employer. Up until that point, Freedom House had only hired Black men. And so Peter Safar comes walking down the hall one day and he stops Mitch Brown, who is a wildly opinionated, very successful guy who was the operations director. And Safar pulled him aside and said, Mitch, we need to hire white people. And Mitch Brown starts going off about, no, we don't, no, we don't, no, we don't. And then Safar says, well, there's this money thing out there. And Brown stops in his track and goes, all right, let's hire a white guy. And Bill Rainovich was, he had been in a military unit prior to that in the Marines that had been, he was the only white guy there. They had suffered quite a bit. They had a lot of trouble because they were an all-Black unit and otherwise white Marine base. And so he was familiar with these things. And so when he arrived at Freedom House, although there were probably some interesting glances shot his way, you know, he jumped right in and embraced his position as a token white guy to help get some money. And, you know, to their credit, everyone at Freedom House, they had one stipulation: can you do the job? And he could. And, you know, he was accepted and off they went. And I asked John, I've asked both of them what their feelings were about it. And as is so often the case, it's the beauty of medicine. It's the great equalizer. If you ask, you know, both of those guys, what was the reaction? The question always was, however you want to call, could you handle yourself? You know, did you know what you were doing? Did you treat these people the way that they deserve to be treated? And if so, then you're a provider and you're one of us.
May I make even one more tiny comment about it? Because you caught me a little off guard on the book when you went so far beyond and talked about the integration into the city and the city's continuing resistance and the fact of how even when Freedom House people got to the city, were treated as second-class people. And I can't even say second-class people because second class would be a higher level. They actually were John, you may comment on this better than me, but what you went through in terms of what went on with the city continuing to act racially. And when I say racially, I'm saying that because I was a white guy, but I experienced and saw it too, in terms of still trying to erase the record of Freedom House. And that was another thing that I found interesting about the book, that you caught that as well, Kevin. Congratulations.
Yeah, John, talk about that, because it's absolutely striking throughout the book, the actions of the mayor, the actions of those people who are making financial decisions to just completely ignore the success and the aptitude that was being shown by you and your crew. What was that like?
Well, it was a somewhat traumatic experience, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
There was a concerted effort to get rid of as many of Freedom House's employees as humanly possible. And in doing that, you essentially erase the historical perspective because all of the people are since gone. So Bill brought out a good point. You're talking about being less than second-class citizens. I came to the city of Pittsburgh with my experience from Freedom House and taught by Nancy Caroline and Dr. Peter Safar. I was the first person to do a tracheal intubation outside of the hospital. And once I got to Pittsburgh EMS, I wasn't allowed to do anything. I was merely an observer on an EMS unit. And that went on for some time until a peculiar incident occurred that kind of really motivated me. We went to a resident's home and walked in, and the person was in cardiac arrest. and he was lying on the couch. And the crews that I worked with at that time knew absolutely nothing about what to do. So in a panic-stricken mode, they looked and turned to me and said, "You take over." So I subsequently directed the cardiac arrest call for the crew at that time, and we subsequently saved the patient's life. But the problem with that is it had to be kept a secret because I wasn't allowed to do anything. So from that point on, it taught me to be more assertive in actually treating patients, irregardless of whether I was allowed to or not. It kind of motivated me to develop that take charge type of mentality, which I continued to do. And, you know, obviously they began to recognize my skills and knowledge and things of that nature, but you almost had to force your way into being accepted by a department that no doubt in my mind or any of Freedom House's other employees, that we were not wanted there. And to me, that's the sad part of that transition period in going into a system where you were less than a second-class citizen. You really weren't wanted there at all.
John, thank you for leading the charge of a long line of paramedics after you who don't always follow the rules.
Yes.
And always acting in the best, you know, always wanting to make sure that the patient gets the best care. It's the most important thing. So, yeah, incredible. You know, we have had a ton of questions and interest about curriculum, and I mentioned it earlier, and we've had questions about from people who are starting EMT programs as educators and how they should incorporate this in the curriculum. We've had questions, outraged people saying, why isn't already in the curriculum? We've had people asking, is it anywhere in any textbook? I want to hear from Kevin and John, or anyone else who's making those decisions. Where are we going to put this in the curriculum? Has it been written in elsewhere? And what can we do to make sure it's there?
Well, one of my concerns is to try and get the history of EMS incorporated into every paramedic training throughout the country. I would also like to see it incorporated into every emergency physician program throughout the country, every EMT program throughout the country. As sad as I am, there are paramedics presently that work for the city of Pittsburgh EMS, and I love that department and I love the people that work there, but they have no knowledge of Freedom House. So as far as hiring paramedics, I would like the history of EMS to be part of the introduction into new employees, to kind of give them a framework of where this career field began. So if we can start at those particular levels, I think that would go a long way in keeping this historical perspective of Freedom House and all of the work that the individuals did and the groundbreaking training that we actually provided.
Kevin, your thoughts?
Yeah, you know, look, as I mentioned, we talk about Napoleon, and you know, there's various points along the way that we know, and I think those are all critical things to understand. You know, and in much the way that Emergency, the television show, has served as this sort of creation myth for EMS that a lot of us have a lot of pride in. This is a true version of that. So there's nothing wrong with Emergency, but Emergency was the fictionalized version of the early days. This is the real version of some of those early days, and it's just as important as any other aspect to be told. And I think a lot of people would be able to see themselves in this story, which is also of critical importance. So it should be taught in classes, and fingers crossed that it does. I know that it exists in certain textbooks. I've heard people say, "Oh, we touched on this, but I didn't know the full story." So it's out there in bits and pieces. The question is, how does it become a larger part of the curriculum? How does it become, you're not going to spend a week talking about it, but how does it become a big part of the story? I don't know, but there are a lot of EMS educators out there, and my advice to them would be, look around. This story exists in different forms. It can be tracked down. There are two people right here that are sitting with us. This is not ancient history. It is living history, and they can be contacted and be willing to speak about what happened.
Wonderful. If you haven't been looking in the chat, everyone, make sure you're watching the important conversations going on around what the National EMS Museum is working on, gathering resources for their archives, knowing that there used to be a documentary by Gene Straczynski. It's no longer available. He was trying to get it distributed, but lack of distribution has definitely caused a setback in getting the word out. Kind of keep your eyes open for opportunities for that. And while we're on the topic of things you didn't know about Freedom House or about the history of EMS, another, I think, important thing that has been happening is there have been reboots of this program. There have been multiple instances where folks and especially EMS leaders in certain parts of the country have decided to make this a model for recruitment and for training. We've seen it in Alameda County. There's a program called EMS Core, and we've seen it in Pittsburgh, again, Freedom House 2.0, which has been happening for the last 2 years. It started in the pandemic, and they're doing, UPMC is doing that same program. But I do want to just quickly ask David Page, who's on our webinar today, about how he began another Freedom House in St. Paul, Minnesota, because that's an important program that maybe kicked off this trend. David, can you unmute and tell us real quick about St. Paul?
You were going to put me on the spot, and I actually think this is all about John Moon and the amazing accomplishments that you've been discussing, and Bill Rainovich, and thank you, Kevin Hazzard, for actually writing this down, because it's living history, as you said. The Freedom House is an inspiration, and so we did have Darnella Wilson and George McCary, Walt Brown, God rest his soul, came to St. Paul when we did a project for inner city youth, and they really were an absolute turning point for ambulance services in the area to realize the extreme lack of diversity today. Even today, there's less than 5 people that are non-Caucasian and working in some of the ambulance services in a metro area that's more than 60% non-Caucasian. So we are still in the trenches. There's still that issue. So I do think that the story needs to be told. And I was glad to see David Strickland from NHTSA give them an award in 2012. There was a very public award. Bill Rainovich was there. And we were able to get some traction in DC to get them a Congressional Medal of Honor. But the more for the educators that are talking about, people need to know this. It is mentioned in the textbooks. Jim Page mentioned it in The Magic of 3 a.m. But Kevin Hazzard really should get kudos as to just writing it down. There's interviews that have been done by Australians available on YouTube that were, sort of interviews of Walt Brown in Pittsburgh when this was occurring. So the model works, and it's so important to embrace it. And Dr. Emily Lavallo and Kenneth Hickey have definitely rebooted it in Pittsburgh with John. So we know it works. There was an article that Megan Corey wrote in GEMS on the reboot as well, if you're looking for information about how to do it. But there's a true effort on the part of the National Registry. ideaforems.com is another place where people are trying to gather and see the revitalization of programs like this.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for your advocacy. It's so important. John, I know you're working on some collaborations and being with those Freedom House 2.0 graduates. They just graduated earlier this week. Tell us about your work with that group. I think they've had 5 or 6 cohorts now graduated. What do you say to them? What do they ask you?
Well, oftentimes when I meet with them, I really go into the history of EMS as we see it today, which oftentimes they're speechless. And one of the things that kind of keeps me motivated with these individuals is they're highly motivated. And that's based on the recruitment, because Freedom House basically used a similar model where we reached out to the community at large and introduced people that had no knowledge of pre-hospital care or EMS and put them into a training program. And it's been very successful, primarily because all of them have actually graduated from the training program. We're trying to use that as a springboard to kind of solve our diversity problems within Pittsburgh EMS, which is unfortunately around 3 to 4%. And unfortunately, there's still a lot of work to do, but I think we have to kind of continue on this path, reaching out to the community, because exposure equals opportunity. And that's the one thing that we wanted to give them.
Well said. John, you talked to them, and I'm sure they ask you questions about what was it like. And everyone's been asking us this. Can you please ask John Moon what some of his biggest challenges, some of his, the things he's most proud of, the successes he's had? What advice would you give to new paramedics and EMTs? Those are big questions, John, but you can handle them.
Well, some of the challenges that I've had, and I don't want to particularly go back to the very beginning, but once I got to a position to make a change in Pittsburgh EMS, I kind of devoted the latter part of my career to doing that. So as a result, I established the very first diversity recruitment program within the Department of Pittsburgh Emergency Medical Services, and it was based on the Freedom House model, and that was back in 1990. And it was very successful. And I continued that up until the time that I left. And once I left, obviously, it no longer continued. But that was really one of the biggest challenges that I had. Unfortunately, as I say, as I was moving through the ranks, I was probably sabotaging my own career. Unbeknownst to me, and to this day, Pittsburgh EMS is the only department in the city of Pittsburgh that has not had an African-American chief. Sadly to say, once I got to that position, they changed the promotional procedures. And we had used that same model for 30 years until I got to a position where I was the next in line to be promoted, and it was subsequently changed, and I ended up having to take interviews with my subordinates. And subsequently, I was passed over for the promotion to assistant chief. And, that subsequently created a different set of problems within the department between myself and my administration. But that was probably the last largest challenge that I'd actually had. But if I had an opportunity to talk to individuals that are interested in pursuing this as a career, perseverance and determination would be the 2 main words that I would use, because all of that requires you to put those 2 words into action as you're going for an EMS career. And it's interesting that I use those, because in one of the presentations I did, they showed a picture of Freedom House's ambulances. And if you look at this vehicle, it had rust along the door frame, and the tires are slightly bald, and the hubcaps are missing, and there's no power steering in these trucks. And the average person would say, I'd never ride in one of those vehicles. You'd never see anything like that within the city of Pittsburgh's fleet, I'm sure. But as I looked at that vehicle, it struck me kind of strange that those things that were wrong with that truck showed determination and perseverance and motivation, that we were determined to accomplish a goal despite any obstacle, any barrier, any distraction. And that's the proudest part that I think about when I think about Freedom House, is that each and every one of us had different parts of our lives that we had to struggle and overcome and persevere through. And we had never once allowed that to stop us from pursuing that goal. And that's the first thing that I'm really, really proud of.
The truck is Freedom House personified. I love it.
Yes.
Love it. Kevin, when you were researching the story, I'm sure you came across things that were unbelievable or surprising, but also heartwarming. You're one of us, right? You're a paramedic. That's where you started. I know if I were to go write the story, I'm sure I would be completely overwhelmed with events and things that I found. Can you share some of those things with us, or what struck you as a writer, as an author, and as a EMS clinician?
I mean, as a writer, I was thrilled by how exciting and high stakes and human the story was. I mean, you know, every great story needs to be centered on the people. It doesn't, you know, numbers and figures and history don't matter so much as the people who do those things. And at every turn, every crazy thing that happened in this story, it was nudged one way or another for the positive or the negative by the people involved. And so as soon as you get into it and you see that there are these incredible personalities that somehow the world has forgotten, that there's a guy named Peter Safar who's nominated 3 times for the Nobel Prize in Medicine, who invented CPR, who was instrumental in creating the world's first paramedics, that Nancy Caroline was that all the things she went through and all the things that she did. I mean, she, you know, everything she does in the US is one thing, but then she leaves and she goes to Israel and she starts their first national EMS program. She starts their hospice program. She spends 8 years in Africa as one of the flying doctors. I mean, it's an incredible personality. And then the people involved at Freedom House, over and over, every person I talked to, I mean, you know, it's lost in the shuffle of this is, you know, this crazy story of Bill Rainovich, who, you know, has this wonderful memory. I mean, I say wonderful, cinematic, but, you know, he laughs at it, of riding in an ambulance with his grandfather. You know, the whole family left in the midst of this panic and they rush out the door and there's no one to ride with the guy. And so he hops in the back and it's this sort of spaceship ride through the city. And he realizes in that moment, that's it, that's what I want to do. So it's such an incredible story. And, you know, the perseverance of the people involved and, you know, the dedication to the job and how hard they worked, from start to finish, that was what stuck with me.
Yeah, agreed. Folks, if you haven't read the book yet, or you're, you know, midway through or something, would love to hear what struck you. This was certainly just ripe for highlighting and bookmarking, and while I was reading. So another question we're getting quite a bit of different versions of is kind of thinking about leadership and how EMS leaders can best attract and retain the next generation of underrepresented minorities. And we've heard about Freedom House 2.0 and some reboots and everything, but if we're not going to do kind of an entire program like that, Kevin, what have you seen in your research and the things that you've come across where there may be programs who are succeeding in making sure there's better representation in recruiting and in retention? And then I'll throw it to John.
Yeah, I was just here in Atlanta giving a talk about this to some EMT students, and I was quite surprised by how diverse the class was. But when I look back at my time on an ambulance, the vast majority of the time, I was the only white guy within 3 miles of where I was. You know, most of my partners, my supervisors, hospital administrators, city administrators, patients, police, firefighters. I think some of it, there's a cultural question of like, who wants to ride on an ambulance? Who wants to join a fire department? Who wants to join the police department? And I've always found, from my experience, that the ambulance drew this, intriguing mix of people because it was something different. It was not, I was never a firefighter, so I won't speak to the good or bad of being a firefighter, but that felt more like a fraternity life, whereas the ambulance, it was this weird mishmash of people. It was this crazy circus of wonderful things going on, and it drew intriguing people. And I think the point of what I'm getting at here is I think that can bring in people of all walks. And, I think that's, we need to find a way to get across to people that this is a career that's going to touch on every single person within your city, regardless of their background or their situation. And it's, it's going to be an ever-changing, exciting thing. And I think the programs who are able to convey that message and have a sense of connection to the community. In Atlanta, Grady is a known quantity in the city of Atlanta. It does not feel at a remove from the city at all.
John, advice for leaders?
Reach out to the community is, I think, the best hook to bring diversity into your department. Just to give you an example, years ago, when I was working for the city of Pittsburgh, there was a policy or a law, if you will, that stated the only way you could become an EMT and or paramedic is you had to be sponsored by a volunteer fire company or a volunteer EMS. Now that was the law in Pennsylvania. So if you look at that, there are no volunteer services in an urban environment, whether it's EMS or fire, they're all paid. So that kind of removes any type of effort regarding diversity in the EMS arena. So what I did at that time is I kind of challenged the state on that policy, where we had a hearing with state legislators and representatives. And I pointed out the fact that you're not going to have a diversified EMS that represents the community in which it serves with that particular policy in place. And fortunately, they listened to our passionate pleas and subsequently dropped it. So now it's actually available to anyone that has an interest in doing that. I would also like to see a scholarship foundation formed in honor of Freedom House.
Yes.
And that in itself would kind of motivate us to attract African Americans for that reason alone, because of the historical perspective. Pittsburgh EMS, unfortunately, when in its inception, brought in all white people. And so you essentially are removing the diversity is point right there at the spot. So now we still have this problem in Pittsburgh EMS because it dates back 45, 47 years, and we're still trying to play catch up. So it's going to be a continuous process, but you have to be motivated to continue to reach out to the community and offer the opportunities there for them, because they're not actually exposed to this as a career path. So you expose them to it, and that creates an opportunity as well as the schools themselves.
Yeah, just the exposure is definitely the first step. Well said. We have a question about treating patients during civil unrest. And of course, John, you were there with lots of riots and some pretty intense things happening in the city. When this happened again with George Floyd and other, tragic events, did you kind of think back to your time then? And what are our steps forward in terms of representing that, as helpers and providers, being in that kind of community in that intense, environment?
Well, that's an interesting point, because if you go back into the late 60s, during the assassination of Martin Luther King, Freedom House played a pivotal role, because at that particular time, it was sort of an anti-police type of mindset. So what Freedom House actually did is kept the lights on in their vehicles when they went into specific areas to treat and or transport patients, which gave the indication that you're looking at someone that looks exactly like you. So we're not necessarily the enemy. So we're here to help you. And that played a major role in making sure that Freedom House was able to play a pivotal part during that time. In today's mindset, I think you have to try to diversify your department. And once you do that, you play an integral part in trying to prevent different things like the problem that happened with George Floyd from a hurricane.
Very good. Just a few comments I want to make sure everyone has seen. We've got a participant on from Hong Kong EMS who says thank you to the guests here today. And another comment that is so poignant is reading the story of Freedom House reads like a complete microcosm of every single battle we fight 50 years later to move EMS into the place it needs to be. And so, John, I kind of want to hear from you and Kevin as we wrap up today. You know, what would you say about this idea that maybe we haven't changed much in EMS, or maybe we have, and where is the work to be done? John, can you start?
I think there's been a lot of change, but primarily the change has been on the medical end, as far as equipment and training and things of that nature. Just to give you an example, when I was in South Carolina, I came across a stretcher that essentially lifted itself, and I had never seen that before. And it's something like video intubation and things like that. So along with those types of changes in medical community, it makes the job somewhat easier. But the problem exists is with the diversity component. And until you tackle that head on, you're still going to have certain problems regarding your system as a whole, not necessarily from the training and the equipment component, but from the overall representation of your EMS systems.
Kevin, your thoughts on our progress or lack thereof?
The more things change, the more they stay the same. In some ways, a lot of the things that I encountered while researching this story are things that we are dealing with today. But I would also say that, there's a willingness among people to listen. I don't think it's coincidence that this story is, being told now. I think people are ready to listen now. And that to me is a big part of it. It isn't simply that, the story exists, but that people are willing to take the time to listen to it and understand the perspective that it's trying to tell and why it's so important. So for me, that feels like a huge win.
Love it. Yeah, as we come to a conclusion today, a couple more important things have been happening in the chat, including an invitation, all expenses paid, for John and Kevin to come speak to Charles Reed's EMT class in Chicago. You guys take them up on that for some deep dish pizza, among other things. And and also, Ken Riddle, thank you for letting us know that the U.S. Fire Administration will be releasing a report in the next few months on fire and EMS response to civil unrest events. That'll certainly be educational. And really cool personal thing here. Jamie Bergman is saying to you, John, when you were my supervisor, I had no idea about your background. I'm sorry I didn't take a greater interest in Freedom House back then. And also says, Bill Rainovich, good to see you. I hope you're doing well. So you've enlightened people who you already knew before with the mysteries. That's terrific.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Everyone, I can't say enough about our gratitude from Prodigy, as well as from all of you being here today to listen to this. And please know that it's on you now. It's on you to go out and spread the word about this and tell everyone about it, and shout from the rooftops what's the things that we are missing in EMS and the history that we haven't been telling. Whether you're an educator or a student or a veteran or a new paramedic, get that word out and do John a service here, and Bill and all the others, Nancy Caroline and Peter Safar, in making sure people know our incredible history. Thank you, John. Thank you, Kevin. And everyone, if you have any questions for us, we'll save the chat here and make sure it gets to John and Kevin. And you can email me at hillary@prodigyems.com with any other questions that you have. We'll wrap it up and say thank you and have a good afternoon.